efforts.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so the way we structured this is really to go through kind of the history behind our riverfronts, both in Milwaukee and in Chicago. Talk a little bit about kind of the renaissance of the waterfronts and how, we've gone from turning our backs to them to looking at them as valuable public space, and then talk through some of those built projects that are really realizing that public space and public amenity that the riverfronts now are. So some of the stuff many of you may be familiar with, but everything really started, when it came to our riverfronts and our waterways within the Great Lakes. It was home to indigenous people. So the Potawatomi tribe, the Menominee, all of those indigenous people lived here way before any European settlers came in. They used it for agriculture, for trade. And so the waterways were a really valuable piece of their culture and their community. And then obviously we came to settle along those waterfronts. And again, still focusing on transportation and trade, and the value that it had to really creating the America that we know today. However, as we started developing and becoming more urbanized at the time, we saw the waterfronts as really a means to an end. How could we use those to grow our communities with industrialization? And in the process, we trashed our rivers essentially with pollution and all of the byproducts of the tanneries and the meat packing. And in Milwaukee, a lot of breweries, which we love today, but we didn't always treat the waste and the outcomes of these industries in a way that was going to pay attention to the environment. And our rivers definitely suffered throughout that entire history. It was still always seen as a transportation corridor. I think even today we see that. But we look at those things through a really different lens now. And so it was really, and throughout the whole process, when things started kind of showing, we started having infectious disease and the impact of our pollution and the waste that we were putting into our rivers, then we really went through this kind of engineering feat of how do we, and in Chicago, reversing the flow of the river to deal with the sanitation and the pollution that was going through there, damming the river in many instances, and really looking at ways to address some of that pollution, rather than doing it through many of the ways that we think of now in terms of working with the natural environment. It was really about controlling the natural environment and finding engineering feats and ways to create structures and mechanisms that were going to essentially control and fix the pollution and the damage that we had done. But in the process, I think we also realized that a lot of what we tried to do, especially now, realize that a lot of what we tried to do just created another problem. So in many instances, like in Chicago, another one of those kind of engineering feats was straightening the canal, which made it a lot better for transportation. But again, it wasn't thinking about the impact to the natural environment. And so it was really, I think, the Clean Water Act of 1972, the start of kind of deindustrializing our cities, that this growing sense of environmental stewardship and understanding our role, kind of coming full circle in the way the indigenous people treat the environment, of understanding our role in working with the environment and not necessarily trying to control it, that has really started this renaissance of looking at our rivers through a public value lens. And so you see this all over the world. It's not just happening in the US. You have cities like Pittsburgh and Boston who have also developed riverfront design guidelines and design standards. And many other waterfront and riverfront communities are taking note, obviously with Milwaukee and Chicago being two of those. But then you also have the implementation of those design guidelines and those standards in physical space with Hunters Point and Olympic Sculpture Park and all of these public amenities that bring people down to the water, and again start to try and make that connection between our waterways and our cities and our experience of those cities. And so Rob actually found this little tweet today, the trend that's going around, the how it started, how it's going. So this is Boston. So you can kind of see, the industrialization of our waterfronts now, and the urbanization, I guess, of our waterfronts now, and how things have changed. And I think it'll be interesting to see how even just Boston changes in the next 20, 40 years. Rob, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
I just thought it was funny. It's internet meme worthy today online. But if those of you guys that haven't seen it before, the Boston Seaport District is quite a model for kind of urban waterway revitalization. You look at some of the public improvements that they've placed along that section of waterfront, and the amount of development and complete streets and public access and all the great stuff that we want to see in our cities and how that starts to become focused in there. It's really become a model for innovation. And this is happening throughout the United States, right? This is happening out in Seattle, especially in their Lake Union district. I was mentioning Boston. New York's got a lot of great stuff happening in the Gowanus area. And really trying to take back their industrial riverfronts, and these are really turning into great places to live, but also great places to work. These are new office developments. These are new condos, new public parks. So it just really some amazing stuff that's going on there, led by a riverfront development, right? And I hate to say it with the old, it's the old, I hate the adage from Field of Dreams, but it's kind of like if you build it, they will come. These public investments do drive development and I think positive change. Getting rid of surface parking lots adjacent to rivers. It is a travesty to have a surface parking lot next to a river, in my opinion. I cannot think of a worse use of a piece of land. So just kind of neat things seen online today. That was timely. If you go to the next slide. So how do we get this all started, right? There's always a vision that needs to be started. When we started in Milwaukee, and when we started in Chicago, there was already some planning documents that were out there. They were starting to set the vision before a lot of our work maybe came online with different guidelines or standards. And so in Chicago, there's planning documents. There's always been planning documents, right? There's always a series of pieces. If you go back though, one more, all starts for us with the river back in the early 90s, with the Riverfront Corridor Development Plan, which led to the first iteration of design guidelines, which then in the early 2000s led to, hey, let's build a Riverwalk downtown in the main branch, right? And then the Our Great Rivers campaign and North Branch Framework, all of these build on each other. And I think, as architecture and planning students, right, that's something that you guys, you're very familiar with and you kind of see on a daily basis, right? This is not always a linear process, but it definitely is something that needs to be built upon, and there are steps to this. So if you go to the next slide. You can go one more ahead here. Yeah, perfect. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about one of our recent projects, this was actually this is a slide from our River Edge Ideas Lab. And so back about 2016, 2017, we were wrapping up a planning project for the city for the river. And they invited a series of 10 firms of nationally or internationally renowned architecture and landscape architecture firms to submit what they called an ideas competition or an ideas lab. It wasn't really a design competition, but as all designers, everything becomes a competition somehow in your own head. So we looked at a section of the Chicago River, basically from the main branch, which the most recent version, which I'm sure you guys have seen, all the way down to one of our parks, Bingtown Park, and looked at a whole bunch of different programming activities and how to really turn it into a unique space. So these are kind of some of the summaries of all the program elements. If you go to the next slide. This is just a couple of the renderings that we have done, kind of thinking about how to move people through the space. And so really thinking about different types of trail uses, so high-speed trails and low-speed trails. That was something we want to think about, right? We want people to be able to use the riverfront to commute. We want people to be able to use it for exercise. But we also want people to be able to walk and linger and enjoy the space as well, and not feel like they're going to get hit by a biker that's going by trying to get their miles in. So if you go to the next slide. So this started to, just look at all the different elements that we can start working into this riverfront. And, if you're familiar with Chicago, it has a lot of the same issues that Milwaukee does with its riverfront, right? It's a fairly narrow canyon. You have building faces right up to the edge of the river. How do you actually build a riverfront or a riverwalk within these spaces, right? You're often projecting out into the water, which has a whole nother host of regulatory and engineering concerns. If you go to the next slide. So it's just a quick nighttime shot. One of the things that I think, all of us as designers can appreciate is, when I mentioned we were going against all the top firms, they all do renderings the same. They're all real pretty pictures. They all will stare. We want to go the exact opposite. So we want these kind of psychedelic video game renderings, which I think help us stand out a little bit. You go to the next slide. And so we looked at a few different sites, oscillation, pulse, and then if you go, I think we have one more after this. And then down here on the connection to Bingtown Park. So part of what this experience was, if you go to the following slide, was an actual gallery space. And so that was the first slide that I showed in this space. And so MPC and the City of Chicago, which sponsored the ID Lab, rented out an art gallery down on the Loop in Chicago. Where they had all of the presentations, bulk materials posted up, and then they would have talks each week. And this was an extremely valuable tool in terms of public engagement, right? We're trying to get people excited about the river. And so each week, one of the project teams would give a gallery talk, and they would show off all of the great ideas that they came up with. And so we did a series of renderings, but then we also did this virtual reality experience. You could clip onto your iPhone. And so this is the former Mayor Emanuel, the planning commissioner, kind of checking that out at one of the gallery openings. Why this is so important is because, again, we're trying to build public engagement on these types of events. And I want to say we ultimately ended up reaching close to, a few thousand people, maybe 5,000 people in this engagement process, Cassandra. Through this, and that really helped lead into our next engagement, which was the Chicago River Design Guidelines, and starting to, again, build off previous work to make sure that this is something that's inclusive and equitable, and we're really trying to engage everyone as much as possible. You go to the next slide. So that was the projects that was going on, and then currently we're also working on the North Branch Industrial Corridor Guidelines. This project is actually very similar, I would say, to the Harbor District, which we'll get into in a second. But this is a very industrialized, or not very industrialized, but industrialized section of the Chicago River, just north of the Loop. This is actually a rendering. If you've ever been to Goose Island, or I'm sure you've had the Goose Island beer before. This is Goose Island, and right now Goose Island is all industrial, but there's a lot of zoning changes afoot to start changing some of those things and turn it into an innovation district. And this was one of our renderings that we did about trying to change the tip of Goose Island, where the North Branch Canal, which is on the right, and then the Chicago River on the left, come to a confluence, and trying to build the signature park and open space along the river. And so this was one of the illustrations from that. You go to the next slide. We also looked at, again, on the North Branch Canal, like, how do we get people down to the water's edge and engage with it? One of the things that we try to do when we do our riverfront planning is, it might sound a little like everyone says this, right? But it has to be contextual. Well, this section of the river isn't downtown. This isn't the main branch Riverwalk. It's not a very polished section. It's a little bit more industrial, right? And so trying to have different materials, different ways to access the river, different plantings that might be a little bit less polished is something that we were looking at, right? Everything needs to kind of work together and tie into the surrounding community. You go to the next slide. And then, further on down the river, right after the Ideas Lab, what came out of that was a desire to implement what those ideas were, right? And so we had all these great designers come together, but how do we get this thing built? So this is actually a rendering or a few images from a phase 1 design study or implementation study that was done through the Chicago Department of Transportation about how to start turning these spaces into a reality. So this is actually right down at Wacker Drive in the Chicago River, just off to the side of the screen by that yellow taxi cab. That's actually the Sears Tower. And so thinking about how we can build pocket parks that then provide accessible entrances and unique spaces down to the riverfront, and then actually building a river walk and river frontage out into the Chicago River, because every building along this side is privately owned. So how do you build something into the river that's all privately owned, right? You're gonna have to create land or have supported structures to do that. If you go to the next slide. So just another look at how this would work with different sections and a lot of different studies in terms of elevations. There's a lot that goes into obviously riverfront planning when it has to do with elevational issues. Another thing that's comparing and contrasting Chicago and Milwaukee. Chicago's riverfront level is pretty static. Even when the city is inundated with rain, if it rains too much, we just open up the locks and dump all the water into the ocean. So kind of like our dirty secret, but one of the things with it is we don't have massive flooding issues in the loop. So therefore, a lot of times we can get away with, not totally destroying a riverfront. If you go to the next slide. Again, just looking at different ways to activate the river, the pink box opportunities. And so we did a lot of planning studies on how to involve potential sources of income for future development. If you go to the next piece. And then all of this kind of culminated in, I think, the last thing I wanted to talk about, which was our work for the Chicago River Design Guidelines. And we'll get into that, I think, those in a little bit here and what some of those entailed, especially how it works with Milwaukee. But Chicago is unique in that, we have a 30-foot section of land that ultimately someone builds a building or does a redevelopment. That 30 feet is dedicated public access, and it is required to be for public use. And the river guidelines set forth a series of guidelines on what those areas need to look like and how they get built. And then there's also triggers or things that we encourage private developers to do, whether those are different overlooks or shoreline treatments or restrooms or things like that. That they'll be judged on a point system to help facilitate those improvements. But with that, I think Cassandra's going to take over here and talk a little bit about the Milwaukee standards, because I think that's what you guys are all really curious about.
So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so while this was going on in Chicago, there was a very similar movement going on in Milwaukee. Many of you are probably well aware of. So the same time that we're having all of these planning studies and these things going on in Chicago, the exact same sort of things are going on in Milwaukee with the Harbor District Water and Land Use Plan, the Riverwalk, the initial Riverwalk guidelines, watermarks that looked at public art and the different spaces along the river. And then even looking at it, not just kind of a little bit of a step beyond even things that were being talked about in Chicago, with actually talking about the water quality and the ecology and the habitats and the environment of the Milwaukee River and the entire system. And you can go to the next slide. And so, at the same time, as all of these planning studies were going on, there was the Waterfront Innovations Design Charrette, where 4 design teams were selected from all over the world to participate in the same sort of exercise as the River's Edge Ideas Lab, of coming up with strategies and visions and ideas for what could happen within the Harbor District. And a lot of this, it built upon the other branches of the Riverwalk system within Milwaukee, the downtown Riverwalk, which has one character, the Third Ward, which has another, and we have a few images of that a little later. But the Harbor District was really kind of the last piece of the puzzle to figure out, what does that look like? And so the Innovations Design Charrette, you can go to the next slide, provided an opportunity to kind of dream big for what this area could look like. And so you'll see some renderings that firms put together of, not just green space along the river, but development potential, softening that river's edge. A lot of the exact same sort of ideas that were coming out of the River's Edge Ideas Lab. You can go to the next slide. And one of those ideas, one of the key ideas, was the Harbor View Plaza. And so with this one, this image shows more of the north side of the Harbor District. The School of Freshwater Sciences is just south of this area in the rendering. You can go to the next slide. And so one of the big ideas was this Harbor View Plaza. So again, how do we get people down to the river? And that was one of the key items, was making it a public amenity. And we realized with the Harbor District that we need to keep those industrial land uses, those manufacturing land uses, but at the same time, there was overwhelming support for getting people down there and getting people, in contact with the river through kayaking, through public spaces, natural areas, and things like that. So a lot of these visions kind of served as the foundation of what would eventually become the Harbor District Riverwalk design standards. So we can go to the next slide.
Just to build on that, Cassandra, I think what's really important is that you want to get people down there in a safe way, because it's actually pretty exciting to see all of this industrial goings on, right, when you're down there, right? Seeing the ships pull up to deposit their material, or, I believe they have the big cement factory down there, right, and the silos that are associated with that. It's really neat. It's something that's super unique and shouldn't be just driven out, I think so.
Right. Yeah. You can go to the next slide too. So, as we mentioned, the Harbor District is really that last piece of the puzzle in terms of getting people down to the river and providing connections and access. And it really built upon the previous sections that we talked about with the Third Ward, the Menominee Valley. And, you'll notice on this page, there are two documents: the Riverwalk Design Guidelines for the historic Third Ward and the Design Standards. And one of the things that was interesting, not just within this process, but also in our work with both Chicago and Milwaukee, was the difference between how the documents are being used. And that word standards versus guidelines is really key, because you have situations like Chicago where the way they use the document is it's not codified. It is not required technically, in terms of it is not part of the zoning code. But it's a tool that the city has adopted that allows them to negotiate with developers and to provide a public good to the city of Chicago residents. But at the same time, there's a greater level of flexibility because it is not part of the zoning code. And then we get into Milwaukee, and the design standards are actually codified and required as part of any sort of development that goes into the Harbor District or the Menominee Valley. And so that's one of the biggest differences. And it's kind of the idea behind the word shall and the word should. You have the word shall in a document, that's something that you will be doing. If you have the word should, it's like, well, it's recommended. But there are loopholes and ways around actually having to adhere to that. And so that was one of the big things, the biggest differences between these two documents, even though at the root of the document, they had the same purpose and they had the same goals. And a lot of that has to do with how the two cities function at the planning and development department level.
And
go ahead.
I was going to hit on the funding piece too. I think that's probably the most important part.
Right. So another one of the differences is that in the city of Chicago, the developer is required to pay for and maintain the Riverwalk. Whereas in Milwaukee, it is a 70-30 split, where the city is actually paying for 70% of the Riverwalk. The developer, the property owner, is paying for 30% of that. The developer then, and the property owner then, has to maintain it. And so that's where it's that kind of gray area of once it's built, it's a public good, so people assume the city maintains it, and if they have an issue, they call the city. But in the case of Milwaukee, it's actually the property owner's responsibility to continue maintaining and keeping, everything up to code and adhering to everything and keeping it open for the public. So again, a big difference behind why it's a guideline versus a standard.
And that's probably one of the biggest challenges when it comes to actually implementing these types of things, right? When you're on post guidelines and you're just like a landscape architect or architect, obviously different developers have different tastes and they have different budgets. You kind of work within these frameworks of guidelines or standards to make it look like a cohesive riverfront that looks public and not like you're walking through a private development. So.
Right. Yeah, and you can flip through the next 2 slides till you get to the small thumbnails. But again, the success of the Third Ward and some of the other sections is really what kind of inspired a lot of the work we were doing within the Harbor District. And another piece of that is what you're seeing here is that it's not just that it was a missing piece that we wanted to fill in, but it was also the fact that we have a lot of new development going in. And so there's the opportunity now to re-envision what these spaces could look like, because there are already architects, designers, landscape architects, planners who are doing that at an individual site level. And so Harbor District Inc., the city of Milwaukee, wanted to take the opportunity to say, okay, we understand that each site is going to have its own priorities and its own character to some extent, especially with the architecture, but how does that tie into the identity of the entire Harbor District? Go to the next slide. And, as part of that, we did a really quick exercise. So the Komatsu site, which you can see it was in the middle on the previous page, the largest undeveloped parcel of the Harbor District, is already in the works to be constructed, and they have a plan and they have a vision. They've been working with the city for a while, but as kind of an overlapping project, we worked with them really quickly to come up with some sketches for, okay, if this is our goal, we don't have the design standards complete yet when this project was, this little exercise was going on, but we still wanted to make sure that we were getting ahead of the development process and the construction to say, okay, this is what we know the design guidelines are going to eventually say, or the design standards are going to eventually stay. This project development site is a little bit further along and is probably going to continue to be further along than the design standards themselves. So how can we kind of bridge that gap and make sure that whatever happens on this site still adheres with the eventual standards that are going to be put into place. So you go to the next slide. So with the Harbor District, this was our study area. You have the spraws over in the map to the right that's outlined. So those were any property that touched that or was part of that overlay zone is what will, as they're developed and as they're improved, will have to adhere to the new design standards. We started looking at what those look like within the Harbor District. There are 2 different zones. There is what we have called more of our urban Riverwalk zone, which is 15 feet. It's 15-foot setback from the seawall. And then there is the multi-use, which has a wider setback. It's 25 feet. And so that kind of alternates throughout the Harbor District zone. And so that was our basis for design. That was the criteria within which we had to develop these cross sections and these standards. And a big piece of the process to do that was community engagement. So you can go to the next slide. So we had stakeholder meetings, we had a bid open house, and we also kind of piggybacked a little bit on an existing event at Harbor Fest. We had about 3,400 people who came to Harbor Fest and visited the booth and talked with us and provided their feedback on things like the signage and site furnishings and plant palette and just in general what they wanted to be able to come down to the Harbor District to do and to see. You can go to the next slide. And so you can see from these photos, we had some interactive activities. There was a lot of dogs. It was fun to see them come in and out of the booth, and we got to talk to a lot of different people of all different ages. We had coloring pages for the kids to participate. We had the sticky notes and the voting activities for everyone, to provide their feedback. And that was directly influenced the standards that came out of it. So you can go to the next page. So as I mentioned, we have 2 different setbacks, and what does that mean for what these spaces are going to look like? So with the multi-use setback, we looked at a 14-foot wide path with a buffer along the edge, and this kind of flex zone. And so while the standards are required, we we worked really, really closely with the city and with the Harbor District to develop these cross sections that are clear enough that a developer and a property owner can understand what the expectation is for them for this site. However, it's flexible enough that if the space that they have doesn't quite meet one of these, or if they want to incorporate something or go kind of above and beyond what the standards say, that there's a flexibility to do that. And so we have this flex zone on the outside. There's a buffer on the river side. Again, thinking about potentially even softening that edge or creating more of a connection to the water trail. You can go to the next slide. And then we also looked at, those 4 cross sections before were the standard ones that are included in the standards, but we also looked at some other options to, again, provide that flexibility for a property owner to say, okay, well, if I know based on what's going on at my site that I have issues with the different water levels, with erosion, with things like that, then here are some other ideas that they could incorporate, whether it's an overhang and a cantilevered river walk, whether it's a platform that can accommodate the changing water levels, and even looking at what it would mean if you actually wanted to separate the bicycle and the pedestrian traffic, if you have the room for it, if you have that 25-foot setback to where you can accommodate the different modes of travel and dedicated lanes. So again, trying to provide that flexibility for a property owner as this trail gets developed. We can go to the next slide. And so on top of that, that was the criteria for how it needs to be designed and what that cross section looked like. But then also, what's the character of this? And this is where, with the community engagement, that we really kind of dug deep into figuring out what the community not just wanted to experience when they were there, but what they felt the character of the Harbor District was and should continue to be. And, we heard words like industrial and rough, and, the brand of the Harbor District is green, gritty, real. And so how do you translate that idea into a physical space? And so that's where the family of furnishings came from that you can see on your screen, using large wood timbers and Corten's weathered steel and wood decking, and even potentially steel grating in some areas. A character that's very unique and authentic to the Harbor District and the land uses that are there, and the land uses that are likely and should remain into the future. We can go to the next slide. And then on top of that, not just the character and the experience, but then we started looking at the natural environment and the ecology. And this was really where the Harbor District and the city kind of took it to another level that hasn't been seen in other sections of the Riverwalk. For example, within that zone, the standards prohibit invasive species, and it also prohibits turf. And you think like turf is the easiest thing for a property owner to maintain, so that's what they're going to want to do. But it's not necessarily the most environmentally friendly, especially along a riverwalk where you have issues like erosion. You have the different aquatic and upland habitats that are located along the river, and so that was one of the pieces of the standards that really stood out, not just in comparison to the other design guidelines and standards within the city of Milwaukee, but I think other standards that are happening from around the country, that a lot of cities aren't necessarily comfortable with prohibiting something like turf, which is a very standard, easy thing for a property owner to do. And another piece of that was the stormwater management. So requiring, the city of Milwaukee already has a requirement that if there is a disturbed area of 15,000 square feet on a site, that you have to incorporate stormwater management practices. But what happens if the site or the disturbed area is smaller than that? And at this time, at least in other areas of the city, there is no requirement. And so what the design standard said was, even if the project does not trigger the stormwater and green infrastructure requirements based on size, that they are still required within that planning area and that overlay zone, at least a minimum of one green infrastructure menu item, which could be a rain garden, it could be a stormwater tree, it could be bioswale, things like that, permeable pavers. So again, trying to make sure that we're thinking about the long-term sustainability and resiliency for this area. You can go to the next slide.
Hey, one thing I just want to mention, Cassandra, is that everything that goes along with the softscape improvements, right, to the stormwater and the landscape is obviously just making sure that we're not just thinking about people. We were thinking about little critters, making sure that we have wildlife habitat, whether that's upland, habitat, but then also in stream or in river habitat opportunities as well. And so that's something that was pretty key to, I think, our planning process. And we had a couple different stakeholder group meetings centered just around that. So.
Yeah, the School of Freshwater Sciences was really heavily involved in this and helping to develop those recommendations and reviewing them. Again, balancing what we wanted to do to improve the environment with the cost and the feasibility for a private property owner.
Yep.
And so the next slide, we also looked at branding and identity. So there's the brand and identity of the green gritty reel. And just like with the site furnishings, how do you translate that into signage and wayfinding that helps people navigate the site and navigate the study area and is really legible for both visitors and people who live there and work there. And so we came up with 3 different options for a signage family and going to the community and to the stakeholders and to the bid district. This is the selected character of the signage. The next step in this, like the standards document provides more of a guideline for this kind of signage and wayfinding element. This would need to be taken into a more kind of technical engineered version to finalize what that would actually look like. But this is the character that was established. We can go to the next slide. And then finally, the last piece of the design standards process was to look specifically at some of the nodes along the harbor district and the riverfront. And these are called challenging segments and public access points. And the challenging segments were challenging because either it had land uses that are essentially in conflict with pedestrian or public use. And so how do we still maintain public access if this land use really shouldn't be people shouldn't be anywhere near this? How do we go around that? How do we navigate it? How do we think about phasing for when that land use may or may not exist in that same location in the future? We were looking at a site that's right north of the construction resource management site, which is an asphalt, essentially an asphalt plant that they can't allow any sort of public access. The property right north of there in the wall up, or the water and land use plan, was dedicated or categorized as a future park site. And so we were looking at what does that look like? Could it be a boat launch? Is there an overlook? And then how do we get people to navigate around that construction resource management site and still connect back into the Riverwalk? You can go to the next slide. And the next challenging segment was by the railroad bridge and Kinnickinnick Avenue. And this being, you can't necessarily get people under the bridge. And so if you can't go under it and avoid both rail and vehicular traffic, how do we safely get people across? And so we looked at a few different options, talked about signage, wayfinding, lighting, and any sort of pedestrian safety improvements that would help to solidify this connection to maintain a continuous river walk. And we also talked a lot in this section about the operations of the Riverwalk, which isn't necessarily incorporated into the standards, but it was an important conversation to have during this process because it allowed the city and the harbor district to not only understand internally how they needed to operate and maintain and use this, the areas that were in portions of the river that may need to close off public access, but it was also an opportunity to maintain that transparency and communication with those properties right up front before Riverwalk is even constructed. We can go to the next slide. And then just some examples of the last 3 public access points of, the Bruce Street boat launch. What could that look like while still maintaining a boat launch, but actually creating more of an amenity with boardwalks and outdoor seating and landscape and bioswales and the middle one being, you know, having some additional trails and natural features that would create more of a public amenity where people are going to stop and stay and want to come visit as opposed to simply passing through. And we can go to the next slide. And then I will hand it off to Rob to talk through, you know, we talked about kind of the process of here's how we plan for a new riverfront or a more public and valued riverfront. And then he's going to talk a little bit about what that actually looks like when it gets built.
Thanks. So how do we realize all that hard work in planning and on the planning side of things and the design side? So, what you're looking at is actually a new section of the Chicago Riverwalk just east of Columbus Avenue. So this is just east of the section that opened up about 5 years ago now. We just worked on and opened up last spring. So you go to the next slide. In addition to that, I think where it all started for a lot of us, or at least our firm, is this image up here on the right and left. This is Pinktown Park. So as Cassandra was mentioning earlier, about this kind of deindustrialization of the riverfront, or how to right maybe historic wrongs that have been perpetuated. You kind of see the image on the left when we talk about straightening of the river. This is it. The line. The river actually used to have a very big bend in it at the south side of Chicago, the South Loop area, and they channelized it and they straightened it. And what you see here on the right is what we've started to do to reclaim that. And so on the bottom, the image on the left is actually the boundary of where Pinktown Park sits today. And so it's really kind of amazing when you think about turning former industrial rail yards and other facilities like that into future public open spaces and parks. And then just to the north of that large bridge, which is called the St. Charles Airline Bridge, you actually have what's called the 78 site. And so that's going to be about a 60 some odd acre site of new development in the city of Chicago, which was just approved last year. Probably a 25 year build out, but they're looking at all sorts of great improvements down there from what they're calling the Discovery Partners Institute, so a very large research institution, offices, apartments and housing, and a 100-foot dedicated riverfront experience all along the west side of the site. So again, really making the riverfront the forefront of the development. So you go to the next slide. So today, just looking at some images of kind of Pinktown Park, and we're reclaiming former industrial lands. This is on the south side of Chicago. It's very close to the Chinatown community. So it has a lot of that kind of vernacular architecture. But again, getting people down to the site. This is at their yearly dragon boat races. I think some of us have participated on that is actually surprisingly hard. And a lot of fun if you ever get a chance to do it. You go to the next one. This is an image of the phase 2. You can again kind of see the St. Charles Airline Bridge to the left and the 78 development will be out in the distance, but this was one of the boathouse projects that we worked on. This is actually a boathouse where they rent canoe and kayaks through REI, and they provide public access down to the water. This is one of Mayor Emanuel's initiatives from his first term in office, where he wanted to build a series of boathouses along the Chicago River to expand recreational opportunities. And so there were 3 that were built, maybe 4 actually, for crew rowing boathouses. And then this one was more of a recreation canoe and kayak boathouse, but it's set within the Pinktown North extension. And then off to the right, you have the field house. So again, what started out as a relatively average sized park 25, 30 years ago now has turned into multiple phases and basically a multi-decade odyssey for our firm. You go to the next slide. And just kind of looking at some of the improvements out there, a lot of natural areas, really trying to make sure that we aren't just planting grass everywhere, but we have natural landscapes and habitat opportunities. You go to the next slide. Just an aerial view, again, trying to find lost spaces. And so this is kind of the split between the two. And so Pinktown is a horribly disadvantaged park, frankly, from an access standpoint, but it makes up for it, I think, in the opportunities it has for recreation. And so cut off from the city with basically train tracks the entire length, and then an overpass separating phase 1 and 2. it's a pretty unique experience if you ever get a chance to get down there to really try to make the most out of what you have. Next slide, please. And then looking back towards the south, and some of the opportunities with boardwalk improvements and ways to get down to the water's edge. This is an area where we actually pulled back the steel sheet piling. Again, something that's really important. I think when any riverfront development is trying to naturalize that edge, so many of these urban and industrial riverfronts have that steel sheet piling, and trying to get away from that, right? Because it's just terrible in terms of habitat and frankly water quality. So at this section, we pulled that sheet piling back and terraced down with naturalized landscape along the shoreline. So this is a really unique feature, and one of the first this close to the loop that was completed. If you go to the next slide. I think I touched on this before when we were talking about the North Branch Industrial Corridor guidelines. So we wrote those guidelines. This was actually the first project that came online post the guidelines. So this is actually C.H. Robinson. This is a large shipping and logistics company. It's their headquarters, but it's right on the Chicago River. This will be part of a larger site that you may have heard about being talked about, but it's also part of the Lincoln Yard site. So this is a large master plan. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I really think you should. The master plan was completed by SOM and field operations, and it has some really unique urban riverfront spaces, but this is one of the first projects that was built within that area. If you go to the next one. Just another image of C.H. Robinson. So this is some of our work on the naturalized landscaping and different riverfront paths along the way. Go to the next. Further up the river, again, just thinking about different uses and kind of fun stuff. This was actually, this is a plan for an old warehouse, I would say like Rockwell in the Chicago River. And they wanted to turn it into a brewery and outdoor drinking and eating establishment. And one of the things we actually, this is a terrible pun, I don't want to say this, but we floated the idea of doing a actual barge or vessel out in the water that they could have events on. So if you go to the next slide, you see a rendering of that. But we were looking at different things with how to treat the shoreline, but then maybe there's some opportunity for some sort of floating event space. This was never really fully realized, but this is now the home to Metropolitan Brewing and their brew pub there. Go to the next slide. This is actually a rendering. It's surprisingly realistic rendering, but this is actually the old Chicago Post Office. You've probably seen this maybe in the news recently. The Chicago Post Office has been vacant for about 30 years in the city, and it's really been struggling to find a developer to take it on and redevelopment. It's about 2 million square feet of office space. But one of the unique things about the post office is it's right on the Chicago River, as Interstate 290, the Eisenhower, comes into the city from the west, and it has a great river frontage, although it is separated by a ramp that goes down below the expressway. We led the planning design of how to really turn this into a Class A civic space. I would say this probably won't ever be fully realized to this degree. We've only built the upper plaza, and that's still under construction, but we're hoping that in the future they'll take on the riverfront edge and provide that public access down to the river's edge. You go to the next slide. This is not our work, but I mean, we just have to show it because we're talking about great urban riverfronts in the Midwest. And so this is actually the work of Sasaki and Carol Ross Barney, among other engineering firms. But this is the main branch of the Chicago Riverwalk, which opened up about 5 years ago now. And this is, I believe, the city winery section, which I'll tell you what, in the past 2 years, it is really taken off down there. On a summer night, it is absolutely jam-packed with people because it's essentially like a mini Bourbon Street in between the bridges. You can pretty much do whatever you want. So a great time if you ever get a chance to go down there. Highly encourage it. You go to the next slide. This is, again, another image from that section of the Chicago Riverwalk that Sasaki and Ross Barney worked on. But this is actually what they call the jetty. What's really interesting here is you see off to the right, it's not a very lush photo because it looks like it's still a little in the winter here, but those are actually floating wetlands. And so, even though this is a very civic-minded riverfront right here, still trying to incorporate those habitat opportunities, fish hotels and different improvements in stream, but then floating wetlands to help clean the water is something that was very key to their design. I think turned out really well. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned before we worked on a section as that divider slide. We worked on the Riverwalk East section, which was essentially Michigan Avenue to Lakeshore Drive. This came online right after Sasaki's and Ross Barney's Riverfront section. And so we kind of envisioned a similar theme where we were trying to divide the spaces up into different rooms. And so we have the dock and the playground. This is a very popular space with vendors. So there's a lot of restaurants and bars down this way, and tour boats. And so if you go to the next slide, trying to look at different ways for people to gather within these spaces. We had a little bit bigger of a section, so this is a little bit more park-like, but different gathering spaces. You go to the next slide. We have some really unique seating opportunities we placed out there that really haven't been done in the city before. And if you go to the next slide, this is actually another image of work that's going on in the North Branch of the Chicago River. So there's an advocacy group in Chicago called Urban Rivers, and they've really been leading this process to install floating wetlands throughout the city, and this was their first opportunity right outside the REI in the North Branch Channel. So again, following along our work in the North Branch Industrial Corridor, this was one of the projects that came out of it, which has been really. You go to the next slide. Again, more urban riverfront development. So this is the, oh gosh, Cassandra, what is this called?
South Bank.
Thank you, South Bank. They changed the design and the name a couple of times. This is South Bank. So this is done by Hershout Landscape Architects. Again, this is all coming online in the past 5 years, 7 years. It's pretty amazing how fast things have changed at least in Chicago. And this has a naturalized edge, beautiful boardwalk, and this is all paid for by the development team just next to this. If you go to the next slide, another vision of our view of the riverfront improvements and kind of amphitheater space they built along there as well. You go to the next slide. In addition, further up river, really thinking about connectivity, right? And we talked a lot about biking and making sure this is a strong commuter link. The Lakefront Trail in Chicago is great to get from point A to point B if you're going to ride your bike to work. But if you don't live so close to the lake, it's not so great. And so this was a project done by Epstein, and this was a bridge section that actually connects about 4 blocks and Horner Park's River Park in Chicago. And this was recently opened up, I think, last year, and it's been wildly successful because it connects, 2 major open spaces, and we're really trying to connect those last pieces along the river for biking in the city. Go to the next slide. I think you need to talk to this one, Cassandra. Yeah. I'm not sure what this is.
Yeah, so we showed a lot of what's going on, obviously in the city of Chicago, but we definitely wanted to do a nod to what has been started and what's going on within the Harbor District since kind of during and since the design standards. So this is an in progress under construction image of the Michaels development site that's on the southern edge of the river. If you go to the next slide, and we've also seen the completion of Harborview Plaza, which was done by Quorum Architects. Quorum was also on our team for the design standards, with the really cool shipping container playground and these like really amazing water features that get you right down to the river. You go to the next slide. I'm not sure which slide we're on because my computer might be a little bit wonky, but you can go to the one that said the final slide that says where do you go from here. So I think with all of this, the renaissance of our waterfronts and kind of reclaiming that land back for public use, I think provides a lot of opportunity for what our cities could look like in the future. And there's a lot of things that we now have to think about, not just in terms of providing recreational access and habitats, but also thinking about climate change and resiliency and long-term sustainability. So we don't know what that looks like, but I think, having everyone on this call who is obviously clearly interested in that, it'll be interesting to see kind of what the next generation of planners and landscape architects and designers do with these riverfronts. Thanks for having us today. It was really fun to talk through this with you guys. And if you guys have any questions, you can add it in the chat or feel free to ask.
Thank you, Cassandra and Rob. And actually, we do have one question in the chat box. Do you want me to read it out, or can you see the question?
Yes, yeah, we can see it from Frank. Yeah, so the City of Milwaukee Department of City Development, they are the ones who are kind of the gatekeepers to the standards and work with the property owners and the developers as they go through the process of figuring out what the Riverwalk section on their property looks like and whether it's adhering to the document, both the Riverwalk standards and all of the other all the other codes and ordinances for the city of Milwaukee.
And we worked hand in hand developing these with them. And honestly, you guys are really lucky. They're a fantastic planning department to work with. We're really, really grateful for them. Great partners.
We still probably have 10 minutes, and I don't know if people from outside of UWM, if they can raise hands or not. If you cannot, if you don't have the function, please add your question here in the chat. Erin has a question.
So the question was, can you please go through the differences between city and developer/owner responsibilities in Milwaukee and Chicago along the riverfront again? So in terms of the construction of the Riverwalk, in Chicago, it is the developer's responsibility to construct and pay for the Riverwalk. Rather than the way it is in Milwaukee, where it's a 70-30% split between paying for the construction of the Riverwalk, City of Chicago kind of works that out in a little bit more indirect ways through other incentives rather than a direct payment of the construction of the Riverwalk, whether that's through other tax incentives or Rob, you can go.
Yeah, no, it adds. Part of, I think, what's unique about Chicago, it's really just, I think, the different approaches of the planning department and city government is the city of Chicago prefers to negotiate. They place their guidelines out there, but ultimately you have to have your plan development approved, and that requires a series of public meetings, plan commission approval, city council zoning, full city council approval. So there's many steps along the way, and one of the things to meet the requirement or get all those things passed is you have to meet the guidelines, and sometimes the guidelines can be a little gray in Chicago, and so that's part of the negotiation process. And I think the city likes that flexibility. Obviously, a little bit different in Milwaukee with standards. It's much more clear cut. The city's paying for the vast majority of it, and so they know, I think, what they're going to get ahead of time, and they just rely on the developers to construct it to those requirements.
And then in terms of once it is constructed, in Milwaukee, it is the property owner's responsibility to take care of that. In Chicago, Rob, I may need you to clarify, is it 2FM or AIS that takes care of the Riverwalks, or is that a property owner?
That's a good question.
Kind of mixed depending on where it is.
It depends on where it is. City-owned land in the city of Chicago is all taken care of by typically 2FM, which is now a new city name, new administration, new city name. And then sometimes they're taken care of by the Chicago Park District. The vast majority of them are maintained by the adjacent private landowner for those pieces. I think got one more question here about future riverfront projects for us and advice for smaller cities. We actually are working on a new riverfront project. It's not a guideline or a standard, but we're doing a new park down in Calumet City, Illinois, which is on kind of the far south end of Cook County on the Little Calumet River, which actually will be it started as a canoe park or a non-motorized watercraft park, but now it's grown to have a little bit of everything. It's funded in part by state of Illinois dollars through the open space land acquisition and development grants. So it will have frisbee golf, outdoor amphitheaters, dog parks, a little bit of everything. And I think it's gonna be a really great improvement for them along the river. I think the advice for smaller cities is it. I think a lot of it helps to with this is to have a strong local advocacy group to help lead the way, to at least get people excited about these types of things, and getting those kind of first teaser images and plans out there. Even just a small rendering of what could be, I think can really get people excited. Once you have that excitement, it goes a long way. I don't think you need to start out and say, well, we're going to do our standards today and start writing the standards. I think you really need to get that vision, and even if it is a small engagement with a local planning or architecture firm or engaging the universities, and having maybe those student projects to help build that excitement and leveraging that, I think is a great way too if you're a smaller city.
Yeah, I think that advocacy piece of it is really important. The plans and the standards and the guidelines and the new developments that have come out of Chicago. There's the Friends of the Chicago River, which is an advocacy group completely based. Their whole purpose is to talk about the river. And then in Milwaukee, I mean, the Harbor District Inc. was really, it's a key piece of that area of the city, and so they were definitely advocates for the development of these standards and all of those bid members who have properties along there, because they saw value in that. So having that advocacy piece to really help push that along is really important.
Do we have further questions? Type fast. I think actually that's a very nice last question, and the answer paving the way forward in terms of riverfront planning or landscape design for different type of cities and the engagement activities. And we really thank you, and the recording will be posted somewhere and Michael will share the information in terms of where we post the video. And thank you very, very much. Sometimes I like Zoom, but when they have the applause function. Thank you. And if the audience have any questions, they can reach out to you guys.
Yes, always. We're